reinsurance. Sorry, Jason, you're from the industry too. And I think we need a really fully functioning insurance marketplace. And at the moment, there are gaps in the market. Typically, if you're a big firm, you might be part of critical national infrastructure. If you're trying to buy a cyber insurance policy, you won't get coverage for cyber warfare. So if it's a hostile state act, that's excluded. Yeah? If it's critical national infrastructure failure or outage, so if the grid goes down, or the internet goes down, or Amazon Web Services cloud is out for 72 hours, again, that's excluded. So whilst I think we've got a rapidly growing cyber insurance market, there are a number of gaps. And I think if we want, a really cyber resilient, successful digital economy, I think a successful insurance market is very much part of that. And there are a number of things that we could do to try and underpin that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that, right at the end there, you put something which I should have mentioned in the introduction, which is, of course, the backdrop to this is as we move from the industrial age, which is, here we are in Manchester, almost the centre of it, been with us a couple of 100 years, to the information age, then this is actually vital ground that we need to protect. Could I come now to the Minister for State, Tom?
Thanks, Ed. It's nice to see you again. Tom, nice to meet you. I worked for your predecessor, you may know. That was about 10 years ago. So it's nice to see you. Look, Tom set out, I think, quite reasonably what the cyber risk is, and some of it's to do with cyber hygiene, some of it's to do with state threats, quite a lot of it's to do with pretty targeted action. My question in all of this is, what's the state's job and what's the private sector's job? What's your job, Tom? What's mine? Because the reality is what we're looking at is one of those challenges that raises many different heads. And so I look at it in this way. First of all, what's the purpose of insurance? Well, the purpose of insurance is to share risk, right? I mean, that's all it is. It's a way of distributing risk across a large number of people so you can each carry a share of the burden that you can afford to carry. You can bear the weight that you can bear. But can you do that if the level of risk you're carrying is so huge because the state, or a foreign state, could easily bring down your entire business? If you're a major corporate, one of the 250, maybe even one of the top 1,000 companies in the UK, can you really genuinely afford to carry the risk of a cyber attack by a state like China, which is attacking us all the time? It's a hell of a burden to carry. Can you really do it? Well, you probably can't. And that's where the state comes in, and that's where looking at that balance between what the state does and what the private sector does is so important. Because actually, what Pool Re demonstrates is that it is possible to create a market even though the risk may be catastrophic. When Pool Re was created in '93, it was because the Bishopsgate, I think it was, the Bishopsgate bomb destroyed a large area of central London and nobody could insure it. The insurance premiums were too high. So what happened was the government provided effectively a cap above which the government would provide the coverage, and Pool Re was able to therefore sell insurance for a known risk below it. And in selling that known risk, it was able to collect a pool, hence the name, which it allowed it to insure greater and greater value. And now I don't know how much you've got, 13, 14 billion?
We've got about a £12 billion financing structure before we call on the British taxpayer.
There you go. So there's a huge amount of gap there beneath which there is a market available. And surely that's the whole point of the state. The whole point of the state is to enable markets to succeed where otherwise they would fail. Now that's a huge achievement. Now when it comes down to cyber, you've got to look at it in a similar way. Because the reality is what we're seeing now is not, some teenager hacking into your computer and stealing some slightly salacious emails from the boss to the secretary. What you're looking at is massive corporate espionage leading to effectively the mass migration of intellectual property and the effectively dislocation of companies overseas. That is a very, very different challenge. So, having some way of the state providing a cap so that the market can rise underneath is surely one of the ways to look at it. The second way to look at it is to look at how the state provides the overall protection, allowing private sector underneath. And there we've already started. In fact, we've got quite a long way down this. As you know, the state protects the UK through GCHQ, or rather on cyber matters through GCHQ. And the public-facing element of it is the National Cyber Security Centre, which provides huge amounts of capability to companies. And if you're in a company, you have not looked at ncsc.gov.uk, you really should. And I don't care what business you're in, you really should look at it, because whatever business you're in, you are a vector of attack to your clients, even if not to yourself. So that's one element. The second, of course, is by supporting many of the startups. And that's where this government has demonstrated the direction, but we've got a hell of a lot further to go. Because the reality is we still see far too much money tied up in non-producing assets in this country, whether it's bonds or whether it's legacy businesses, where actually what we need to do is to get it into startups that are really transforming things. And if you look at Manchester, or indeed Newcastle or Bristol, you're seeing some of the most extraordinary and exciting startups that this country, in fact, that this continent has produced in the last 10, 20 years. You're seeing some phenomenal companies made of young people who are really demonstrating the challenge of how to address this cyber threat in ways that, frankly, nobody else is thinking about. Now, that's hugely important, but that's where, again, the public-private partnership comes in. That's where the state has a role in making sure that the tax system and making sure the employment system is adaptive and working for the cyber resistance. Because the truth is, cyber resilience is like every other form of resilience. It's not just down to cyber professionals, it's down to the entire state and to everyone in society. And that's where we need to be going.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the National Cybersecurity Centre, and at a similar event where I was speaking a few months back, a very senior, very senior American in cyber, who I can't name, it's all under Chatham House, pointed out that he thought the NCSC was globally leading. Yeah. Indeed, the point of this panel is to identify the areas where we do have that global lead, and then ask how we build on them, which is a perfect segue to someone who was involved in the coalface of setting up such organisations. So I think I can see on the screen at the back there we have got Sally. So Sally Walker, over to you.
Thank you. I just want to echo the Minister's points there that cyber isn't someone else. Cyber is absolutely the foundation of our society. A point that's been made very clearly to me this morning, because I'm sat here in Cheltenham and we have a town-wide cable outage. So I'm very grateful to my neighbours who are on a different provider who've allowed me to come and sit in their office so that I can join this debate, and hopefully I will have reliable internet. Cyber. It's a term I spent more days than I would care to admit debating when I was in government. And when I left government, to my surprise and sadness, I discovered the term was very little understood outside specialist worlds and the industry sectors that focused on it. And it was far too often condemned to something that the IT department could fix. So for the panel this morning, I want to focus on one question and one question only, which is, as we look at this foundation of our society, the IT, the digital environment, the cyber world that we all depend on, is what can we trust? It's the integrity side of the debate, because if you go back to the triad of basic information security, which applies equally to the cyber debate, you have three pillars. The first is availability. Can I get online? And that's in the public and the industry eye because of the scourge of ransomware, which is at an extraordinary scale. You've got the confidentiality pillar, which is the constant backdrop to the privacy and security debate, and something the UK has been world leading in since Bletchley Park, the making and breaking of codes to protect against the theft of data. But the third pillar of information security is also critical, and what I want to focus attention on today, because that's systems or data integrity. Is what I had yesterday still operating as I expect it to? It's, does my system function today as it did last month? And if not, do I understand why? And can I trust the data? There was a cyber operation now some more than a decade ago against Iranian nuclear centrifuges. It's known now as Stuxnet. And that exploited the integrity of the system. And when the integrity of a system is in doubt, the impact can be significant and long-standing. We don't yet, I think, believe there are widespread operations run against the integrity of systems, although no one would dispute it is within the art of the possible. But given attribution of cyber operations is hugely challenging, and the fact that integrity risks are being realised, and the impact, as I say, can be significant and long-standing, what does that mean for the insurance world? It was demonstrated by the issues with Horizon IT at the post office arguably possibly the largest miscarriage of justice in UK history. It was demonstrated with the emissions scandal with VW manipulating the output of engine software. Machines not doing what they were expected to do. No one's arguing those were the actions of hostile state actors or criminals. But they demonstrate that our systems absolutely have to be trusted. So in the confidentiality space, if someone takes it, we understand what insurance looks like against theft. In the availability space, if someone breaks something, we understand what the insurance world looks like against accidents. But if someone owns our systems, if someone else has control of them, what does that look like? It's a challenging world, and I'm not offering any answers yet, but I hope we can debate it over the course of this panel. Ed, thank you.
Sally, thank you very much. And yeah, the wonderful question of trust there, because this is a murkier world. And as you quite rightly point out, when in the more mechanical world things were stolen, we know where the loss is. And you've pointed out that here we can almost end up arguing about, was there a crime in the first place? So some really interesting points. Paddy, would you care to finish off the panel's remarks and maybe sweep up on what's been mentioned before? Over to you.
Great, thanks very much, and wonderful to be on the panel, not least because I've worked with, I think, everybody on this panel at some time or other, so great to be here. And you might want to listen to me because of my experience in government service, both helping with offensive and defensive cyber, and dealing with major events, Cobras and all that stuff. But actually, that isn't the reason I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you because I, nowadays, with Brunswick Group, support major listed companies globally when they suffer major technology events, of which ransomware, as characterized by several members of the panel, are to the fore. And what's really interesting when that happens is that their world falls apart. And corporate leaders running huge businesses, often transnational businesses, find they're dealing with something for which, frankly, they and their organization are not equipped. And so when I come at this, the way I think of it, there are kind of two or three things. The first one is, I think we all have to understand that we, as regards the technology risk, the cyber risk, to businesses and to government, but I'd argue more to businesses than to government, because government understandably protects itself in a slightly different way, that we are in a state of equilibrium rather than stability. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't know which of you have watched The Roadrunner. I used to watch it as a child, and there's a wonderful moment when Coyote goes over a cliff and ends up on a branch, bouncing for a moment before the branch breaks and he falls to the ground. While he's on the branch, he's in a state of equilibrium. Roadrunner on the ground is in a state of stability. And recognizing that there is potential for this to go catastrophically wrong, right, is a key part of managing this. Now, that creates really strong drivers for prevention, as Tom referred to, and Sally and the Minister. So absolutely a strong driver for prevention. But actually it also means we have to do that classic risk thing of thinking about reasonable worst case scenarios. We occasionally get a glimpse of them. I think with the Colonial Pipeline attack in the US, which was a criminal attack, not a state attack, we saw the ability to cut off energy in wintertime to a significant part of the American population. So that wasn't a fully systemic event. So we know that it can have effect. It hasn't quite happened to us yet. And so that drives then how we think about this. Now, two other points. First of all, that our understanding of this phenomenon is really problematic because no one has a God's eye view. GCHQ is the most marvelous organization, but understandably, their highest priority, I suppose, is the nuclear firing chain, and they work their way down from that. And after a bit, frankly, they run out of resource, and they can't be worried about, what goes on in corporations. As Tom rightly said, there has to be a division, and not least because, frankly, you have to have jeopardy, and people have to be responsible. But the effect of that is that no one has an overview. The insurance market has an overview. It knows how bad this is because coverage, there's less cover available for much more money, and many more are being excluded because they don't meet the standards required to get on the ladder for insurance. Most of the businesses I talk to are uninsurable for a period after they've suffered from an attack, and these are major corporations. So there's a problem with situation awareness. There also is a problem that we understandably, because bad things aren't fully happening to us, we tend to focus on prevention. Now that's a good thing. That's been policy for a while. I was part of the organisations that kind of developed that as policy. And businesses think a lot about response. If something happens, what should we do? What's our business continuity plan? And maybe they insure for that. Very few realise just how bad recovery is going to be, just how difficult it is, given that businesses now are, frankly, data organisations. They are network systems. There isn't a business that isn't. And so the effect of that is that you need wraparound support, and as Minister rightly said, you need to share out the risk. Now, we're going to talk today a lot, I know, about fundamentally what the market can do, and my view is at the moment that the market is going away from us. This is not a mature market globally. The levels of reinsurance are not what they are for other forms of risk, and it isn't clear to me how well it would survive a systemic event. I think it would not survive it well. There are a few other things, though, to reflect on when we think about insurance, and these are proven and studied. There are some other effects if you have a really healthy insurance market. So one is you have really good situational awareness. And having good situational awareness, you can define what works in prevention, and that supports the startups that Tom was talking about, the Minister was talking about. But also, it builds the workforce that enables you to secure your systems. And when there's a systemic event, businesses respond and recover much better. And there are specific studies which I could take you through if you had the time.
Thank you very much indeed. And just to pick up on that last point about insurance markets and situational awareness, many on this panel, probably the man on my left more than most, have been pointing out the systemic threat from China. I would argue that before government systemically could recognise that, not that individuals in government didn't, then it was friends and colleagues in places like JP Morgan back in 2008, 2010, who were really tracking where the money was moving, who was being undercut, what was happening, for example, with German photovoltaic panels. So a really important point here about when we're dealing with such big risks, that actually to think that government, with its intelligence agencies and what have you, has a much better view is maybe not right. And to that end, if I could open up a discussion around the panel with just a couple of questions. And the first, many panelists have spoken about the importance of data. Paddy just said every company these days is a data company. We're surrounded by industrial age heritage around here, but all those companies which the Minister spoke about are digital startups. But if we looked at those threats and we asked what those threats are doing now and what they used to do, anybody want to have a guess at the IP theft cost just of China? I don't think we've worked it out, but it is probably in the trillions, in the trillions of dollars. In the industrial age, if that had been $1 trillion worth of piracy of oil on the high seas, we'd have known exactly what to have done about it. So my question around the panel is, do we yet, let's take not just from the UK perspective, but the Club of Democratic Nations, which we tend to be in lockstep with, have we properly, do you think, codified the threat from where state actors meet criminal enterprises in the information age, and is there more that we could do to therefore allow us to take action when things do happen? Maybe you'd like to kick off.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and I mean, when you think about piracy in the Mediterranean in the 1800s, the reality is that the attacks on shipping got to the point that the French decided to colonize North Africa, and it got so bad that one of the Americans' first naval engagements under Jefferson was the raid on Tripoli to free Christian slaves from what's now Libya. So states do respond to private attack, or rather to attacks on their trade. And the reason Pax Britannica was so important was because we were guarding international shipping. My own view is that that's where we should be getting GCHQ and the NCSC to, and in fact it's the direction that they're very solidly going in, which is they've guarded, the Royal Navy guarded the sea lanes, GCHQ needs to guard the E lanes, and that's where we're getting to. But insurance played a huge part in that as well. Shipping wouldn't have happened without insurance. It simply wouldn't have worked. The level of risk for each individual journey was far too great. The challenge is that where we're responding with state and private, others have a very different way of looking at this. If you look at the cyber attacks coming out of Russia or China, for example, the division between state and private is very, very hard to draw. There is no real such thing as a private company in China. They're all owned by the state. The Chinese Communist Party has people on the board of every single company and controls their actions. There is no such thing as private IP theft coming out of Beijing, Shenzhen, or anywhere else. The Chinese state is actively targeting British businesses and stealing our IP. That's what it's doing every day. Every single day. Now, we are doing what we can to protect ourselves, but exactly as Tom and Paddy has put it, we need to work with the private sector too. But that's where we need to be really conscious as to the threat we're facing, because there's a lot of talk of outreach and cooperation and win-win. Well, win-win means China wins twice. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that there is a cooperation or cohabitation that we can live with at the moment, because the Chinese state is nothing but an aggressive attacker on British business at the moment.
Thank you very much. If I could come to you then, Tom, from your perspective on that. Is there a shared understanding of risk across that private-public
Well, I think
the nexus?
the question of attribution when it comes to cyber events is problematic. You know, if something happens and you sit there and you say, well, was that an act of cyber war? Was it an act of cyber criminality? Was it cyber terrorism? That can take years to divine and often involve a lot of litigation. Businesses don't want to hang around for 3 or 4 years before they get their cyber claims paid. Actually, a system that I think should be considered is actually classifying cyber attacks based on their magnitude, not the threat type. I.e., you know, if it's a particularly big cyber attack and it's above a certain threshold, well, that's so big, it's too big for the insurance industry, that's for government. Actually, if it's below that threshold, then the private market should absolutely pick that up. So having some kind of event classification system based on magnitude rather than threat type, I think would be worth considering. I would just say, you know, if there were, though, to be a really catastrophic cyber attack from a hostile state like the Minister was saying, let's say it's China, essentially that is today broadly excluded by the insurance industry. And therefore, if the losses were enormous, that risk implicitly sits with the government. I think the whole point of public-private partnerships, and this goes back to really what the Minister was saying about pool re, is you know, if you can get some kind of backstop or support from the government, you can allow a private market to develop where none previously existed. And you can build that buffer, that pool of private sector capital, which will take the first 10, 15, 20 billion pounds of loss to protect the taxpayer. And I think that's really the success of pool re over the last 30 years, is in building a flourishing private insurance market for terrorism. The other thing I would just mention about public-private partnerships, particularly pool re, is that we actually monetize the support the government gives us. So typically we spend, or we pay rather, about £250 million to the government every year for the guarantee they give us that we haven't once called upon in our 30-year history. So I think that's another nice aspect to our PPP, is that actually it's not only a means to create a buffer, but it's actually a way for the government to monetize the support it provides. The other thing I would say about our pool is that by having a fund there that's ready to pay claims, you don't have to hastily assemble a bunch of liquidity policies to pump money back into the hands of businesses after an event. And so actually you can pump liquidity back into the economy after a big shock rapidly, predictably, and effectively without sort of fraud or waste. So yes, I mean, I do think that when we think about some of these really big cyber attacks, they're simply too big for the insurance industry. The private sector should absolutely play its part and do what it should do. And it needs to do that actually for the sake of its own relevance, not just the resilience of the wider economy. But there comes a point at which it's too big. I think divining where that point comes is not easy, but there is that point where actually it does have to sit with government, because the market cap of the UK insurance industry is only £21 billion. So if you're looking at a £200 billion event, there's only so much it can do.
No, thank you very much. And I thought the obvious segue there then is to Sally, because you were involved in setting up the agencies that we've already spoken about, but especially the National Cybersecurity Centre. Your perspective from there about the relationship, that cutting-edge government agency with working with the private sector, both those that are cyber literate and are involved in the business, but those that don't know they are, but probably need to.
So for the sake of debate, I think I'll come at this from a different perspective, which is that the intelligence agencies, ours and hostile, only need to get involved when all other avenues have been exhausted. So I think it was the Canadian government who looked very systemically at what they called statecraft by some of the hostile threats more than a decade ago, because they noticed that their industries were being brought up a decade ahead of thinking around strategic influence over particular sectors. It's much easier to buy intellectual property than it is to steal it. So it's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about cyber being separated as a thing that sounds like IT, or things that sound like data managed by IT specialists, because we've really got to have holistic understanding. And the second part of that, and as the mum of teenage boys, you look at what is accessible to a government like the Chinese, who understand exactly what our children are influenced by and how quickly, because they've got TikTok. They've got access to all of our children and complete understanding of how their brains operate and how their decision-making is influenced online. And as someone who's involved in cyber operations, I think this is of profound concern for society.
Completely right.
Yes, absolutely. And if those that don't know, Chinese companies will sell this software very cheap, but the quid pro quo is you send the data back to China. So if anybody here who's doing business in Zimbabwe goes through Harare Airport, you will be scanned multiple ways, and the data will be back in Beijing by the end of the day. And they are storing that, and they are using that to train AI models and all sorts of things. And this is this is what is just going on day to day, and I would argue maybe not fully recognised for quite a while across our polity. Which brings me to Paddy, maybe because you sat there as a DNSA thinking about this. Do you think that government does manage to tap into the private sector and pick up the zeitgeist, as it were?
I think it's extremely difficult. As I say, government runs out of capacity. Even if you've got an agency like GCHQ and a cutting-edge cyber organisation like the National Cybersecurity Centre, I mean, very quickly runs out because we're dealing with something which is a pandemic of cyber difficulty, whether it be the ransomware criminality, Russian language, which is criminal, or the intellectual property theft, state organised, which Tom described so well. So the scale is just far too great. And also, we live in a free society where not every data movement is monitored by the state, perhaps unlike some other states we could mention. So, which limits what you can do. So I think government is constrained. It was constrained when I was dealing with it for David Cameron and Theresa May, 2014 to 18. Well, it's even more constrained now, given the scale of it. And as Tom rightly said, coming at us is the accelerant of artificial intelligence, which is neutral. So it's doing incredible things for application security, but it also does incredible things for the writing of malware. It does both. And quantum will then just do that on steroids, or quasi-quantum computing as it comes through. So I think government's got a real difficulty, and that's my point about equilibrium. I am personally quite frustrated that we aren't thinking about the support that we give after a systemic or near systemic cyber event. We knew before because of pool reinsurance with terrorism, but my word, we know after COVID that at a certain point, government comes to the rescue if businesses begin to fall over because of an external event. So we know that. So we could prepare and give ourselves headroom now and improve the muscle memory and connectivity so that we're quicker in response. And there is national advantage in being quicker in response. It's better for the citizen, it's better for the nation, better for the economy. So I'm really quite frustrated that there's still the market provides, because the answer is yes, the market provides while we're bouncing on the twig before we fall to the ground. But it's not going to help us once the twig breaks. And that's my frustration and why I was glad to be on this panel.
No, thank you very much. I know I'll be supported by at least one ex-reservist here, but in a shameless plug for reservists, it was about 3 years ago when I had an excellent bunch of reservists pulled together, mostly ex-city folk, to counter Daesh finance, but we kept them going. And they actually wrote stuff for Boris's red box that led to the National Security Investment Act. And I just wonder whether we are using reservists, people who have skills, who can cross this private-public divide and making best use of them, and whether we're still overly a little stovepiped. With that thought, maybe you'd like to address that. Just ask the panel, where do you think we've got the balance right when we're dealing with these advanced persistent threats, let's call them that, whether they're private or public? Because it does seem to me, we talked about win-win, that if you're China, you know you can assault us every day, as you have outlined, Minister, but there's not going to be that much coming back. We will defend against it. Do you think we've got the balance right here? Have we got the offensive capacity of the Royal Navy as was, which you mentioned, referencing the Barbary Coast? Do we have the balance right? Have we made the argument if we wanted to push the balance a little bit further?
So I'm not going to talk about our offensive capability for rather obvious reasons, but Paddy, come on, don't tempt me. But one of the things that I was going to touch on is, you know, this isn't just corporate. When you talk about ransomware or you talk about these different challenges that we're facing, these are not just corporate threats. The reality is ransomware is used to extract Bitcoin from companies in the UK that is then used by countries like Russia to pay intelligence officers and agents who use it to pay for activities in other countries. They transfer it into cash by swapping it with criminals or with terrorist organizations that have raised cash, who then use that money either to buy weapons or to buy drugs or whatever it happens to be on a dark market. So the connection between state, ransomware, terrorism, and crime is very, very strong. It overlaps almost completely. And so what we're dealing with here is not some sort of esoteric cyber challenge. It is a very fundamental national security threat, much as the IRA threat was to London in the 80s and 90s. And this is where I think we've got to understand what we're talking about between the actions that the government needs to take through GCHQ and other elements, but also the actions the government needs to take in finance terms. Because if you create a market, as Paul Reed did, you do two things. One, you remove the government from the level of risk that it initially has to hold. Because the reality is, unless you're going to leave somewhere like Bishopsgate to go completely derelict and abandon it, which you're not going to do, right? The government is going to have to step in at some point and provide the insurance. So if you can separate the government from that as far away as possible, you do two things. You enable that reconstruction to happen quickly, and the second thing you do is you create a market, so you raise money, so you actually price insurance properly. Because otherwise, the only way insurance is priced in the UK is through taxation, which is clearly an absurd way of pricing risk. So what Paul Ree has done is they've found a way of pricing risk that means that you then have a pool of capital you can invest. Now, the reality is that cyber risk in the UK is, broadly speaking, underwritten by taxation. That can't be right. That cannot be right. That's why we need to be working on a similar way of separating the government from the risk, creating a market, enabling that money that has been taken to provide investment into, well, anything, frankly, possibly even some better cyber defenses. Because if we get this right, we can then create a market similar to the way that we created an insurance market in the 1700s that creates an entirely new industry. And just to pick up on Sarah's point on TikTok, I mean, Sarah, you're absolutely right about data theft. The thing that worries me most about TikTok is it is a news organization that is remarkably well tuned to delivering elements of news that you, or rather that young people, wish to hear. And its editorial board is made up of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, there's a lot of people in the UK who are concerned about foreign ownership of media. TikTok is one of the biggest media providers to the under-30s.
I'm just going to give everyone on the panel a chance to come back on anything else, and then it's a warning to the floor that I'm going to be opening the floor up for questions very shortly. So, Tom.
I was just going to pick up on what the Minister was saying. I do think that one of the roles of the private insurance industry is to incentivise good risk mitigation. Prevention is cheaper than cure. In the same way that if you have a burglar alarm and you lock your windows, or if you've got a shop and you've got a sprinkler system, it keeps your premiums down. We can incentivise the same sort of preventative behaviours to mitigate or even prevent cyber from happening in the first place. So I think risk-based pricing, that's where the private market can actually help. Because actually, I think insurance is often seen as just a pot of money sitting there collecting dust, waiting for a rainy day. Great, but actually more important is the risk mitigation aspect, and I think that's often underlooked.
Paddy, did you want to come back and pick up on
one thing which
I
know Sally will also have a view on, which is, I think there's a general thing for all of us here, which is challenging, particularly if you're my age, which is we've got to have a dynamic understanding of the effect of technology. And it keeps on getting away from us. Facebook became prominent in the middle of the first decade of the century, and we've now got the online safety bill now, 17 years later. TikTok, we talk about TikTok. TikTok has massive penetration in this country. What do we think, 15 million, 16 million users? Huge success, because it's the most fantastic product with the effects that Tom talked about. So we've got to shorten that curve, and we've got to have a dynamic understanding of it. And that dynamic understanding absolutely is about public-private partnership and discourse. And in the cyber domain, it absolutely has to be about risk, because the dynamic change in risk, the use that is being made today, which I could take you through, of large language model, artificial intelligence, to write code for certain use on the internet is fundamentally different from what was going on 9 months ago. So we need to have that in, not all of you thinking about that particularly, we've got to have a dynamic understanding of the development of technology and our response, and it's got to be part of our political discourse. Otherwise, frankly, we're going to lose.
To get you all very worried and to put some numbers on that, very good friend of mine, international expert in AI, was telling me that in January this year, it cost you about $10 million to train an AI model. When he spoke at a conference in May, he said that's come down to $1,000. I rang him the week later to say I'm going to use that stat. I must have written it down wrong. He said, no, but I've just got a paper from Stanford University. They've trained one on $600. So suddenly, even though in a previous panel I heard someone say you need a lot of capital for AI, and that is rapidly becoming democratized. And then you can use AI. The AI that will produce you drugs will also produce you nerve agents of a viciousness that humans hadn't thought of. So there are real problems here that we have to get, and as Paddy said, it is moving very quickly indeed. Sally, your final thoughts before I open up the floor for questions.
Just to link my horrible feeling I've got the Zoom button wrong. Just to close my opening statement around trust and that final statement around data and AI, data is the fuel that is energizing AI systems. And whether that data is trusted or untrusted, whether you have ownership of that data or it's been stolen, data is fundamental to national security in the future.
Sally, thank you very much. Now, we've got about 50 minutes left and a raft of questions. Now, to make sure you keep them pithy, I'm going to go with people who have their hands up first. I'm going to take these three. Chris, questions, please. We'll write them down and then we'll address them. Thank you.
Thanks. Ali Griffiths, Gisborne Partners. On the point of resilience, picking up on your point and Sally's point, two things. The government has regulations in place already to protect critical national infrastructure. The NIST regulations and NIST 2, the EU is being far more effective in actually enforcing those. So, that will prevent a lot of activity if we actually enforce those. So what is the government doing about that? And to Sally's point about holistic awareness, what are we doing to ensure that boards who typically might not have the cyber awareness, what are we doing to actually help them have a better understanding of cyber so they can fulfill their governance duties?
Thank you. So EU and board duties, please. Thank you, Ali.
Thelma Mattock from Sutton Coldfield. Linking on to this, how can we make CEOs of private sector more accountable? With this rapid changing environment, a suggestion would be criminally liable if they haven't got a proper cyber risk policy in place. I think there should be more disclosure in the accounts. We've got anti-slavery, we've got this, that and the other, but in view of the importance of this now, there should be a greater awareness, because you have a lot of IT now reporting to the finance function, and that's more about cost, and they don't focus enough on the cyber risk threats.
Great, thank you. So CEOs and actual legal accountability. Thank you very much.
Jason Groves from City of London. Of course, we have City of London Police, which works very closely with business on improving cyber resilience. My day job is with Marsh McLennan, the insurance brokers. And I just come back on Paddy's point. Actually, there's been significant growth over the last few years in the cyber insurance market, particularly in the US. And to reinforce what Tom said, it's one of the biggest advantages of that rise in cyber insurance has been the improvement of cyber resilience, particularly among large companies in the US. And you've seen the number of cyber attacks that have been reported on US companies fall. And we think that's because as companies have to get cyber insurance which is affordable, they've had to go through a much more rigorous procedure to improve their resilience, to improve their risk to the insurance market. And so I think, to your point, that boards and executive committees are taking this much more seriously. What Sally said, I think, is absolutely right, that this needs to be something that is looked at a board level and an exco level. But as Tom said, I think that public-private partnership, what are the incentives to improve that? We have large companies in this country that are buying more cyber insurance. They're going through this resilience. We would really improve that if we encouraged mid-sized companies and SMEs.
I'm going to cut you off,
Yep.
so we're going to get another round of questions in.
But to take those
incentives.
learnings.
You've asked about incentives, yes. So the question was what incentives to make everything you've described even better.
Exactly.
So thank you. Maybe because we had EU in the first one.
Do you want me to pick it up? Right.
Look,
this is one of those areas where I think Rishi's doing absolutely the right thing. First of all, Rishi has re-engaged with the European Union in a positive and productive way. We've stopped shouting at each other and throwing bricks at each other, and we've started actually talking, which is at least healthy. Look, there are challenges in the way that we manage this because we do not have the protection, comfort, whatever you want to call it, of a market of 400 million people tied to us. So we have to be that much more responsive now. Now that has upsides, which means we have to be more efficient. It has downsides, which means we have to be more imaginative. But either way, however you look at it, this gives us an opportunity to demonstrate some leadership in some of these areas. But it does mean, and you're completely correct on this, it does mean that we have less leverage over large companies and large institutions that are looking to shape the world to their interests and to their corporate interests. So that's, of course, that's true. But I do think that the work that we're doing and that we're alongside DCIT and others is making a difference in trying to make our regulations more adaptable and better able to engage with these areas. The challenge is, as you rightly say, that large entities will shape them more strongly. The US is one, the EU is another, and China is a third. Of course, they are much, much larger markets than we are. So we need to find the adaptability through that. The second point was, in some ways, similar from both, which is about the holistic awareness and how do you get accountability. And that's where, if you want to keep someone honest, put a price on it. That's what insurance does, right? How risky is the journey to the other side of the world? Well, price a premium and I'll tell you. And the same is true on companies at the moment. At the moment, as I say, too many companies are effectively insured by the state, where their insurance premium is whatever they pay in corporate taxation. What we need to do is we need to get to a position where the premium they pay is based on their behavior, based on their risk profile, based on their engagement with agencies or institutions like NCSC and perhaps others. And that's where insurance keeps you honest. If you want to keep someone honest, put a price on it.
Thank you very much. If I come straight to Tom, the incentives question here and also maybe the liability. What the practicalities of achieving what the Minister has laid out?
Well, I think the Minister gets right to the nub of the issue, because I think that effective public-private partnership exists where the public sector sets the standards and determines whether they're mandatory or optional, what disclosures are required in the annual report and so forth, and then that's enforced by the insurance industry using risk-based pricing. So if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you can't get cover, or you pay a hell of a lot more for it than you would if you did the right thing. And I think on boards, I suspect there is a lot more regulation, certainly in the US, that I'm aware of coming down the pipe, where there will be, I suspect, criminal sanctions, certainly sort of strong civil sanctions for directors who are found wanting, and it wouldn't surprise me if something like that came across the pond at some point. But I think that in fairly short order, I think regulators will be picking up on, do boards really understand their vulnerabilities? yeah? And I suspect a lot of boards right now don't. If you asked, 11 directors around the board to go away and write down, well, what is your cybersecurity posture? You get 11 different responses. So do you understand where you are today and where you're trying to get to? And are you trying to get to gold-plated cybersecurity or not? But you need to actually sort of pick a target. You then need to make sure you've got a playbook, and you've got to practice that playbook and figure out how you can run your company when the IT doesn't work. Yeah? You've got to instill that discipline I mentioned earlier around not clicking on those phishing links, because it just takes one individual. You might have 5,000 staff to click on that URL, and they're in the back door, and then suddenly you're into that sort of ransomware nightmare scenario. And make sure you've got good advisors as well, because you probably need them. And it's not just about having, if you're a board, just about having a good IT function. I think the lesson I'm learning is a holistic response. It's about comms and marketing and the whole 9 yards.
As that answered, I think we've swept up already some good answers to that point. So there were a whole load of questions over here. I'm going to take these three gentlemen here, please. Same as the other questions managed. Chris, questions, please.
Hi there, my name is Jonathan Smith. I'm from Kettering. I run a small cybersecurity company that specialises in helping SMEs approach cybersecurity. And I was a bit disappointed that nobody on the panel has ever mentioned Cyber Essentials. It is by far the most successful cyber security initiative that the government has in this country. And it is something that the government should be using and leveraging more. And I'd be interested to hear the panel's opinion on whether there should be a new step from Cyber Essentials that sits in between ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials. Going back to the original point from the member, which is that these are all British things that we've done, and we should be celebrating those and putting something between those two.
Great. So Cyber Essentials as a key. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Robert Courtnidge from the Payment Association UK. Sir Jeremy Fleming, GCHQ, has been going on for over 2 years now about the biggest threat to the West is the digital yuan, the digital currency that China has been pushing out and has been looking at the whole area of brick and road where they are more vulnerable to be taking on this new technology, as you say, pumping Chinese technology for payment systems into these new countries. So far, we've been very slow in the West and the US to try and come back and have a viable alternative to digital currencies being interoperable to take on the digital yuan in those countries. So my question is, what can we do as a country? And obviously, we as Payment Association want to push the UK, and we're working with Bank of England, HMRC, etc., in HMT to come up with solutions in that space.
Thank you very much. One more question then, please. Thank you very much.
Riccardo Tordera, also Payment Association, but my question is not about the digital one. It's more personal and relates on the TikTok thing. I don't have TikTok, but many friends have, and sometimes I've asked, why do you use it? Like, you perfectly know that these days, but who cares? So if this is the answer from a generation, and they have access to even younger generation that don't even think that this is a threat. And, we are a democratic society. Our governments get elected by people who have ideas. If this is the perception, that's a non-problem, where are we going to end?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Those will probably be the last questions, I have a feeling. Paddy, can I come to you first? And Sally, stay prepared. I'll come to you, and then I'll finish with the two on my left and right. Paddy.
Yeah, great. So on this question of standards, there's a problem. And there's a problem also in criminal sanction. And that is that if one drew a picture of the scale and nature of threat, you do a very steep pyramid, and at the base you've got commodity ubiquitous threat, which all of us face all the time, and at the top you've got, I don't know, APT10 Chinese zero-day exploits on the cloud, right, which are going after specific intelligence. I've dealt with them for a commercial client, okay? You're not going to stop them at the top. Sally would tell you when we worked at GCHQ, my colleague Keith Alexander, former head of the NSA, when they want to get in, they get in. So when we think about that stack, we've got to draw a line through it and say, this down here we can do with Cyber Essentials plus ISO 27001, NIST, ISF, we could go on listing them. But there's a poor correlation between those standards and your ability to deal with the higher end techniques. And also there's a commercial reality about the legacy infrastructure and the shadow IT that are present in large enterprises. artificial intelligence in many businesses is becoming shadow IT because people are going onto ChatGPT to ask it questions when they're not allowed to do it on their own machines, they do it on their home machine, and suddenly your company data is in ChatGPT through someone's iPad. So drawing these lines, I think, really matters, and it's wonderful there are businesses like yours that are supporting SMEs who probably neatly fit into that category of thing where we can bring through different standards and they will have effect, but there's a poor correlation for larger, higher value businesses, the standards they apply, which is why insurance matters so much, because your insurance premium is incredibly live because there's one thing insurance people hate most of all, and that's losing money. And so when they see a threat emerging, they immediately change the standards they apply to you for your cover. So that's a fantastic, much more dynamic than NIST, Cyber Essential Plus, or any of those other standards. That's probably enough for me. Oh, just if I may, I think it's really important to recognize, thinking about dynamic understanding of technology, the digital yuan is a surveillance tool. Yeah? If you make a payment in it, you return to a repository in China with no limit on holding where you were, the device you were using, what you were doing. And that sits in a big heap and doesn't go away. Right? And it's the most incredible surveillance tool, and it's has got into Southeast Asian markets and elsewhere. So it is about competition in the digital currency space and payments, where we have a national lead, but it's also actually about fundamentally what we believe about surveillance and the rights of the individuals, which we should be discussing when we talk about that technology.
Great, thank you very much, Paddy. Sally, did you want to pick up some of those bits? You mentioned TikTok yourself earlier on.
Yeah, I just think there's something fundamental about what culture we want. And that's what culture do we want in society? What culture do we want in business? I would actually reach to the airline industry, who drove out risk by generating a culture that was around the understanding of near miss. I think that's a profound challenge for the insurance industry. We need a trusted environment in tech where there can be full sharing of vulnerability, where there can be honesty about near misses, where there needs to be benefit to actually exploring and exposing things that are not yet well understood or where people need help. We've talked a lot about GCHQ and the National Cybersecurity Centre today. Everything that we did in the cyber world came from a profound attention to culture and ensuring that that culture was one of learning beyond everything else.
Sally, thank you. As an ex-aviator myself, I just want to reinforce that point. And I would say where aviators share the near misses so someone else doesn't have them. In a lot of cases in ransomware, of course, things were swept under the carpet to avoid the embarrassment. So we had exactly the opposite. A very good point, Sally. Thank you very much. And now just to quickly wrap up, there were a couple of other points in those questions where, if I could come to you first, Minister, and then Tom, if there were.
Look, on the TikTok point, I mean, for generations, people thought smoking was fine. For generations in the 1700s, people thought publishing pamphlets in printing houses that nobody had any accountability for was freedom of speech. The state rapidly decided that actually the level of revolution and the amount of deaths that it caused was possibly not worth the cost. We haven't yet seen what TikTok's doing. It's already exaggerating in different ways news stories in order to sow division and to sow disharmony in our societies. And there is a genuine question as to whether democracy can continue when your principal news agency is controlled by a hostile state and a party designed to actually do you harm. So can you really run a democracy if a third of your news for your youngest members of your society is being edited by the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, I think it's a real question, right? I don't think it's I certainly don't think it's an answer. I'm afraid the Chinese are not our friends on this. The Chinese state is not our friend. On the point about the digital yuan, well, Paddy said it out quite right. It's an intelligence tool. It's not a currency. And you can tell it's not a currency because it doesn't have a free-floating yuan behind it. It is not. China's attempt to create a reserve currency will fail so long as they do not have a free-floating currency. And they can't have a free-floating currency because it's an autocratic state. So this is not an attempt to create a new form of exchange. This is an attempt to control. That's all it is. And many states have already realized it, and those that haven't are quickly waking up. And then on Sally's point on near misses, I completely agree. And having that understanding that if you haven't had a cyber attack yet, the operative word there is yet. And to have companies like yours, sir, starting out and helping SMEs is essential. And that's where I think the incentive that good insurance products can provide is incredibly powerful.
Thank you very much. And final point, Tom, would you like to sweep up any or all?
Briefly, I agree. We do need robust, proportionate cyber hygiene standards. Sorry for not mentioning Cyber Essentials. My own business is Cyber Essentials Plus accredited, so we're compliant. But they need to be dynamic, those standards, because, you know, I've got multi-factor authentication, which we think is the bee's knees in terms of warding off the bad guys in Russia. Give it 6 months, they'll have cracked that. So you've got to be constantly evolving your cybersecurity standards, and you've got to be linking it through to the insurance underwriting process. So it's reflected, as we've been saying, in the price. So you incentivize good behavior, because as I said earlier, prevention is cheaper than cure. And I agree, it's going to happen, I'm afraid. It's a question of when, not if.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm terribly sorry I've overrun by a couple of minutes. I'd just like to say, as a trustee of the Imperial War Museum, we are racing to get Cyber Essentials qualified, and it evolves and demand keeps increasing. It's actually quite difficult for some institutions to keep up with it, and that's why it's almost at the top of our risk register at the moment. What we've covered today are the links between the private and the public sector, and the fact we do have some things to build on in the UK, such as the National Cyber Security Centre, but we must not get complacent. This is evolving incredibly quickly. You've heard how hygiene and education and training across the workforce, incentivised with carrots and sticks, is absolutely essential, because, as Tom said, prevention is better than cure. And we've looked on this side of the table at the politics of this, that government cannot be the person who underwrites this risk in its entirety, but we've also looked at the utility of insurance as a regulator in this area of what is great risk to an economy that is underpinned now by data and it being shipped around the cyber networks on which we all rely. So I would like to thank the panellists in the room. Minister of State Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much. Paddy McGuinness, thank you. Virtually from Cheltenham, having shown us some of the dangers and worked her way around them. Thank you very much, Sally Walker and Tom, and also thanking you, Pool Reinsurance, for sponsoring this event. Could I ask you to thank all our panellists?